My parents invited me to dinner to make amends after 5 years of absolute silence. They promised it would be an intimate evening to heal our fractured relationship. When I walked into the private dining room of Atlanta's most expensive steakhouse, I did not find an intimate family reunion. I found 20 people: aunts, uncles, cousins, my golden child sister, and her arrogant white husband. They had already demolished a feast of Maine lobster Wagyu tomahawk steaks and 3 bottles of vintage Bordeaux wine. My dad wiped his mouth, smiled at me, and slid a $4,000 bill across the table. He told me to pay it as an apology fee for abandoning the family. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply called the waiter over, whispered exactly 2 sentences into his ear, and watched his face turn completely pale. 10 minutes later, the restaurant manager walked in with 4 security guards, and my family learned a very expensive lesson about the daughter they threw away. Before I tell you exactly how I ruined their night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic relatives that you are no longer the punching bag they remember. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and for the last half-decade, I have been the undisputed villain of my family. Growing up in a strict household in Atlanta, image was the only currency my parents Patricia and Marcus truly valued. Their standing at our local church, their community board meetings, and projecting an illusion of flawless success meant everything to them. My older sister Chloe was the golden child. She was beautiful, loud, and deeply skilled at playing the role of the perfect daughter. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one. I was supposed to be their ultimate trophy when I got accepted into a prestigious medical program. But when I realized my passion was in high-level finance and corporate acquisitions, I made the unforgivable decision to drop out of med school to start my own firm. To my parents, I was a total disgrace. A college dropout who threw away a respectable career to chase pennies. They cut me off financially, emotionally, and socially, telling everyone at church that I had lost my way. What they did not know was that the small consulting firm I started from my cramped apartment had evolved into Vanguard Holdings, a massive private equity firm. I am the chief executive officer and majority partner, but I kept my wealth entirely hidden. I preferred being the black sheep if it meant they stayed out of my bank accounts. When my mother reached out last week claiming she and my father realized life was too short to hold grudges, a foolish part of me hoped they had actually grown. I put on a tailored emerald green suit and drove to the Obsidian Room, a notoriously exclusive restaurant downtown. The moment the hostess opened the heavy oak doors to the private dining suite, I knew it was an ambush. The room was packed with my extended family. My mother sat at the head of the table, dripping in flashy jewelry. Beside her was Chloe, draped over her husband Brad. Brad was a shady real estate investor who loved to flaunt his white privilege at our family gatherings. My parents absolutely worshipped him because he drove a leased Porsche and threw around buzzwords like capital gains. They practically kissed the ground he walked on, completely ignoring his condescending attitude toward our culture because they believed his whiteness and supposed wealth elevated their own social status. The dining table was an absolute disaster zone of pure gluttony. Empty seafood towers, bone marrow mashed potatoes, and empty wine bottles that I knew cost $800 each were scattered everywhere. They had started the dinner 2 hours before my scheduled arrival time. As I walked in, not a single person asked how I was doing. Not one aunt or uncle inquired about my life. Instead, my father Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, a smug look crossing his face, as the head waiter placed the thick black leather bill folder directly in front of him. My father did not even open it. He simply pushed it down the long polished wood of the table until it stopped right in front of my hands. "Welcome back to the family, Maya," my father announced loudly so the whole room could hear. "Since you missed 5 years of birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, we figured you could pick up the check tonight. Consider it a small price to pay to earn your way back into our good graces." My mother nodded vigorously, adding that paying for the family was the godly thing to do to honor my parents. I slowly opened the folder. The total printed at the bottom was $4,250. They expected me to panic. They still thought I was a struggling 20-something who would have to max out credit cards and empty her meager savings just to appease them. A heavy silence hung in the room. My aunts and uncles watched me with barely concealed glee, eager to see the prodigal daughter squirm. Before I could even formulate a response, Brad let out a loud, theatrically obnoxious sigh. He adjusted his expensive cuffs and looked at me with pure disdain. "Come on, Marcus, do not embarrass the poor girl." Brad drawled, his voice cutting through the silent room with an unbearable arrogance. "We all know a lowly bookkeeper cannot afford a tab like this. She would probably have to take out a payday loan just to cover the tip we owe the staff." Chloe giggled, burying her face in his shoulder. "You are so right, babe," she chimed in. "We do not want Maya getting evicted from whatever tiny apartment she rents these days. Let the adults handle the finances." Brad puffed out his chest, reveling in his role as the wealthy savior of his wife's family. "I will handle this one. It is pocket change for a real estate developer anyway. That is how real investors operate. I will take care of the family as always." He pulled out a sleek, heavy metallic credit card and tossed it onto the center of the table with a loud clatter. "Waiter, run my card, and bring me another glass of your finest bourbon." A chorus of praise erupted around the table. My aunts and uncles showered Brad with compliments. My mother beamed at him like he was a deity sent from above, then shot me a look of pure disgust, silently condemning me for my supposed poverty. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not argue. I did not try to defend my career or my bank account. Instead, I leaned back in my leather chair and smiled. It was a slow, calm, terrifying smile. I raised my hand and subtly caught the eye of the head waiter, who had been standing awkwardly near the corner of the room. He rushed over, bending down respectfully next to my chair. I leaned in close so that no one else at the table could hear me. I whispered exactly 2 sentences into his ear. "Brad's credit limit is maxed out and Vanguard Holdings just acquired this restaurant group last week. Tell the manager I want that card declined and security brought in immediately." The waiter stiffened, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. He recognized the name of the parent company immediately. He looked at me, then looked at Brad's metallic credit card sitting on the table and swallowed hard. He nodded frantically, not saying a single word, and rushed out of the private dining room as if his life depended on it. The family went back to ignoring me, laughing and praising Brad for his immense generosity while I sat there sipping my tap water. 10 agonizing minutes passed. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. It was not the waiter. It was the general manager of the restaurant, accompanied by 4 burly security guards in dark suits. The room fell completely silent. The manager walked straight up to Brad and dropped the metallic card onto the table with a sharp thud. "Sir, your card has been declined," the manager announced, his voice carrying zero warmth. Brad's face turned beet red as my family gasped in confusion. "Declined. That is impossible. Run it again. Do you know who I am?" "We ran it 3 times, sir," the manager replied smoothly, standing his ground. "Insufficient funds. Furthermore, we just received a direct mandate from the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Hospitality, the new parent company of this establishment. They have instructed us to inform you that no other payment methods under your name will be accepted and no tabs will be opened. You and your party must produce $4,250 in cash or valid cards right now, or I am instructed to call the Atlanta Police Department for theft of services." Total chaos erupted in the private room. My mother gasped loudly, clutching her pearls as if she was going to faint. My aunts and uncles started panicking, checking their own purses and wallets, knowing none of them had that kind of money to spare. Brad stood up, furious veins popping out on his neck, as his facade of wealth shattered in front of his in-laws. "What kind of garbage establishment is this?" Brad screamed, pointing a finger at the manager. "Who the hell is the CEO of Vanguard?" I calmly picked up my purse, stood up, and smoothed out the fabric of my suit. "That would be me," I said, my voice cutting through the panic like ice. Every head snapped in my direction. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's jaw practically hit the floor. "You?" My mother screeched, her carefully crafted image breaking into a million pieces. "You are lying. You are nothing but a dropout. I walked slowly toward the door, pausing just behind Brad's chair. I dropped out of medical school to build the private equity firm that bought this exact restaurant last Tuesday, I said, looking right into my mother's shocked, terrified eyes. Enjoy washing dishes to pay off that Wagyu beef, Mom. Oh, and manager, my glass of tap water is on the house. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving my family to deal with the bill they tried to force on the daughter they thought was worthless. I watched the heavy oak doors click shut behind the terrified waiter. For the next 10 minutes, I sat perfectly still while my family continued their grotesque display of gluttony and self-importance. Brad was busy recounting a completely fabricated story about how he outsmarted a local city councilman to secure a zoning permit for his latest real estate venture. He waved his silver fork around like a conductor's baton, pointing it at my aunts and uncles who nodded along in absolute awe. Chloe hung on to his every word, her diamond rings flashing under the ambient light as she stroked his arm. She shot me a smug, condescending glance every few seconds, making sure I was adequately absorbing my own inferiority. My mother, Patricia, chimed in loudly, thanking the Lord for bringing such a strong, capable white provider into their family to elevate their social standing. She actually bowed her head and made a point to pray for my lost soul right there at the dinner table. She asked God to guide me away from my stubborn pride and my dead-end bookkeeping job, hoping I would find a respectable man to rescue me before my biological clock ran out. My father, Marcus, simply grunted in agreement, pouring the very last drops of the $800 Bordeaux into Brad's glass, while completely ignoring my empty water glass. Exactly 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors did not just open, they swung wide with a forceful, heavy thud. The boisterous laughter at the table died instantly. It was not our server returning with a polite smile and a complimentary round of after-dinner mints. It was the general manager of the restaurant, a tall, impeccably dressed man, whose face was carved out of absolute stone. Flanking him were 4 massive security guards in dark, tailored suits. Their physical presence commanded the room, instantly sucking the air out of the space. My aunts and uncles lowered their forks in unison. The clattering of expensive silverware ceased. My mother clutched her pearl necklace tightly, her eyes darting frantically between the security guards and the manager. Marcus sat up straight, his chest puffing out defensively, while Brad simply looked annoyed at the interruption. The general manager walked with purposeful, measured steps directly toward Brad. He did not offer a polite greeting. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out Brad's heavy metallic credit card, and dropped it onto the center of the wooden table. It landed with a harsh metallic clack that echoed loudly in the silent room. "Sir, your payment method has been declined," the manager stated, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who did not tolerate nonsense. Brad's face flushed a deep, angry red. The veins in his neck visibly pulsed against his stiff white collar. "Declined." Brad scoffed, waving his hand dismissively at the manager as if batting away an insect. "That is entirely impossible. Your machine must be broken, or your staff does not know how to operate it. Run it again. I have a credit limit higher than your annual salary." "We ran it 3 times, sir," the manager replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact for a single second. The system returned an insufficient funds error across the board. Furthermore, your secondary card linked to your dining profile has also been flagged and frozen by your bank. Brad slammed his fist onto the table, making the empty wine glasses rattle violently. "This is an outrage. Do you have any idea who I am? I am a prominent real estate developer in this city. You are making a massive mistake, and it will cost you your job." Chloe immediately jumped to her husband's defense, her voice shrill and panicked. "How dare you humiliate us like this in front of our family? Run my card immediately." She dug frantically into her designer handbag, pulling out a gold card and shoving it toward the manager. The manager did not even reach to take it. "Ma'am, our system automatically runs all linked accounts under the reservation profile when an astronomical bill fails to process. Your card was also declined for insufficient funds." Panic began to ripple through the family like a shockwave. My aunts and uncles started whispering furiously among themselves, clutching their own purses and wallets, terrified they would be asked to pitch in to cover the massive bill. My father Marcus stood up quickly, trying to salvage his precious pride in front of his extended family. "Now listen here," Marcus said, using his deepest, most authoritative church deacon voice. "There is obviously a technical glitch in your system. My son-in-law is a very wealthy man. I will cover the bill for now to save us this embarrassment, and you can apologize to him later." Marcus proudly produced his own premium credit card. The manager took it, calmly pulled a sleek mobile payment terminal from his inner jacket pocket, and swiped it right there in front of everyone. A loud, sharp beep signaled the rejection. The screen glowed bright red with the word "declined." My father stared at the little red screen as if it had just insulted his ancestors. My mother gasped loudly, gripping Marcus's arm with perfectly manicured fingernails. "That cannot be right!" Patricia cried out, her perfectly curated image crumbling into dust right before my eyes. "Try it again. We have money in that account." The manager shook his head. "I am sorry, ma'am, but your available balance does not cover a $4,250 charge." The humiliation in the room was absolute. The great Marcus Jackson, who had spent the last 2 hours lecturing me about financial responsibility and life choices, could not even afford to pay the tip on the dinner he invited me to. Brad completely lost his mind. His white privilege, usually masked behind expensive suits and corporate jargon, burst out in an ugly, visceral display. He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward, and he pointed a finger just inches from the manager's face. "You listen to me, you incompetent fool!" Brad spat, his voice echoing harshly off the mahogany walls. "You are a lowly wage worker in a glorified cafeteria. You have no right to speak to me this way or humiliate me in front of these people. I will have your job for this. I will call the owners. I will drag this restaurant's name through the mud until you are all begging for unemployment checks on the street." The security guards immediately stepped forward, closing the distance, their hands resting near their communication radios. The manager did not flinch, nor did he back down. "Sir, I strongly advise you to lower your voice and step back," the manager said, his tone dropping to a glacial chill. "You will not be calling the owners. We just received a direct overriding mandate from the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Holdings, the private equity firm that acquired this entire restaurant group last week." My family froze in place. The name Vanguard meant nothing to them, but the tone of absolute finality in the manager's voice terrified them to their core. The manager continued, his eyes sweeping across the panicked, sweating faces of my family. "The chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings personally reviewed this transaction. The directive is crystal clear. No alternative payment methods under the name Brad or Marcus Jackson will be accepted. No tabs will be opened. No IOUs will be honored. You and your party must produce $4,250 in physical cash or valid cards immediately. If you cannot produce the funds within the next 10 minutes, I am instructed to lock these doors and have the Atlanta Police Department arrest every single adult at this table for theft of services." Total, unadulterated chaos erupted in the private suite. My mother started hyperventilating, fanning herself desperately with a linen napkin. Patricia was terrified of the police, terrified of the scandal, and absolutely terrified of the church gossip if she was dragged out of a high-end steakhouse in handcuffs. Chloe started crying hysterically, slapping Brad's chest, demanding to know why his accounts were bouncing and why he was embarrassing her. My aunts and uncles were shouting over each other vehemently, denying they ate any of the expensive food, frantically trying to distance themselves from the bill to avoid arrest. I sat calmly in the exact center of the hurricane. I finished the very last drop of my tap water, set the glass down gently on the table, and picked up my designer handbag. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk blouse with steady hands. The manager turned directly to me and offered a deep, respectful bow. "As per the CEO's instructions." "Ms. Maya, your glass of tap water is entirely complimentary. You are free to go. Have a wonderful evening." Every single head at the dining table snapped toward me. The shouting ceased instantly. Brad's mouth hung open in silent shock. My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. Patricia's eyes widened to the size of saucers as she looked frantically from me to the manager, and then back to me. "How do they know your name?" Patricia whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. I walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors, the security guards parting seamlessly to let me through. I paused right behind Brad's chair. I looked down at the man who had mocked my career, and then I looked at the parents who had treated me like a complete failure for 5 long years. They know my name because I am the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings. I said, my voice projecting clearly and powerfully across the silent room. I dropped out of medical school to build the private equity firm that bought this exact restaurant last Tuesday. Enjoy figuring out how to wash dishes in your designer clothes. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private suite, leaving the doors wide open so the rest of the restaurant could hear them screaming and blaming each other as the reality of their situation finally set in. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, casting a warm golden glow over the skyline of Atlanta. I stood near the glass, sipping a freshly brewed espresso, feeling a profound sense of peace. That peace lasted exactly until my intercom buzzed. It was the head concierge of my building. His voice was tight with professional panic as he informed me that a large hostile group of people claiming to be my family had breached the outer security gates and were currently making an absolute scene in the main lobby. They were demanding to see me, refusing to leave, and threatening to call the local news stations if they were not granted immediate access to my residence. I did not panic. I simply took another sip of my coffee. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and slipped into a flowing emerald green silk robe that swept across the hardwood floors. I did not rush. I let them wait. I wanted their desperation to simmer. By the time I stepped into the private glass elevator and descended the 40 floors to the grand lobby, the situation had devolved into a full-blown theatrical performance. As the elevator doors slid open, the sound of my mother wailing echoed off the imported marble walls. Patricia was in rare form. She had thrown herself onto one of the velvet lobby sofas, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, sobbing loudly for the benefit of the wealthy residents and the increasingly alarmed building staff. Marcus stood beside her, his face a mask of exhausted fury. Chloe and Brad looked like they had not slept a single wink. Their designer clothes from the night before were severely wrinkled, and Brad had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. I could only imagine the humiliating phone calls they had to make at midnight, begging their church friends and country club acquaintances to wire them enough cash to escape the restaurant without being arrested. 2 armed security guards were moving in to physically escort my father out of the building. I raised my hand with a swift, commanding gesture. I told the guards to step back and give us space. I wanted to handle this personally. My mother stopped her fake sobbing the instant she saw me. She shot up from the sofa, her face twisting from manufactured sorrow into venomous rage. She pointed a shaking finger at my face, her voice echoing through the massive lobby. "You ungrateful, wicked girl!" Patricia screamed, not caring who was watching her. "Do you have any idea the humiliation you put us through last night? We had to call Pastor Thomas to wire us money. We had to beg the deacons for an emergency loan. You made a mockery of this family in front of the entire city. You are a cold-blooded monster." I stood perfectly still, letting her scream, letting her expose her own toxic nature to everyone present. "You are exactly the same spiteful child you have always been," Patricia continued, her voice reaching a fever pitch. "I should have known you would pull a stunt like this. You have always been a thief and a liar. You are acting just like you did when you were 19. You stole your own sister's savings and ran away like a coward in the middle of the night." A few early morning residents paused near the elevators, their eyes widening at the dramatic accusation. Chloe crossed her arms, smirking at me, as if our mother had just dealt a fatal blow to my character. Brad let out a loud, arrogant scoff, shaking his head in mock disgust. They genuinely believed they had the upper hand by weaponizing the past in a public setting. They thought public shaming would force me into submission, just like it did when I was a teenager. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The marble floor was cold beneath my bare feet, but the fire burning inside my chest was absolute. "Stole her savings." I repeated, my voice deadly calm, slicing through the tension in the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. Are you actually going to stand in my building in front of my staff and bring up the money from when I was 19? My mother jutted her chin out defiantly. Yes, you stole $25,000 from this family and disappeared. You left your sister completely devastated right before her wedding. I laughed. It was a dark, humorless sound that made my father shift uncomfortably on his feet. Let us get the story straight for the audience you so desperately wanted, Mom. I projected my voice so every single person in that lobby could hear the truth clearly. That $25,000 was never Chloe's savings. That was the money I earned scrubbing toilets, wiping down cafeteria tables, and working 3 grueling minimum wage jobs for 3 straight years to pay for my medical school tuition. That was my blood, my sweat, and my desperate attempt to build a future. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her a single second to breathe. I took another step forward, backing her right up against the velvet sofa. And do you know what happened to my tuition money? I asked the room, my eyes locking onto Chloe, who suddenly looked very pale. My own mother secretly forged my signature, drained my entire bank account, and used every last dime of my medical school fund to buy Chloe a custom imported wedding dress and to pay for Brad's luxurious honeymoon in the Maldives. You stole my future to fund her vanity. Gasps rippled through the lobby. A woman holding a small dog near the front desk actually covered her mouth in shock. Brad looked away, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Chloe uncrossed her arms, her smug expression melting into raw, undeniable panic. You told the entire church congregation that I was a troubled youth who ran away because I could not handle the pressure of school. I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. You spun a beautiful web of lies to cover up the fact that you robbed your youngest daughter blind just to buy your white son-in-law's affection. I did not run away, Mom. I escaped. I escaped a family of leeches. And now you have the absolute audacity to stand in the lobby of the building I own, crying because I refused to let you steal from me one more time. Patricia was trembling, completely stripped of her righteous victimhood. She looked around frantically, realizing that the wealthy onlookers were not pitying her. They were looking at her with absolute disgust. The narrative she had carefully controlled for over a decade had just been incinerated in less than 3 minutes. My father, Marcus, could not handle the public humiliation of his wife. His fragile ego shattered, and his face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate malice. He stepped in front of Patricia, pointing a thick, aggressive finger right at my chest. "You think you are so smart?" Marcus growled, his voice dropping to a nasty, vindictive octave. "You think because you have a fancy title and a nice silk robe that you are untouchable. You think you hold all the cards now because you embarrassed us at a restaurant." I tilted my head, looking at him with utter boredom. "What exactly is your play here, Marcus? Are you going to ask me to pay for your parking validation next?" Marcus sneered, reaching into the inner pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick, legal paper and slammed it against his palm. "You talk a big game about exposing us," he spat, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "But you forgot one very important detail, Maya. You forgot about Big Mama's house." My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. Big Mama was my grandmother. She was the only person in the Jackson family who ever showed me unconditional love. Her small, historic wooden house in the heart of the city was my only sanctuary growing up. It was the only place I ever considered home. When she passed away, she left the deed in my parents' names, trusting them to keep it in the family forever. Marcus saw my reaction, and his smile widened into something truly ugly. "That is right. The only piece of earth you actually care about. The sacred ground where you go to cry on her death anniversary. Well, I have some bad news for you, Miss CEO." He unfolded the paper and shoved it aggressively toward my face. "I just signed the deed of Big Mama's house over to Brad last week," Marcus announced, his voice booming with toxic pride. "Brad needed collateral to secure a massive commercial loan for his new luxury development project. I put our family home and Big Mama's house up as collateral to back my son-in-law. The bank accepted it. It is done. You do not have a single inch of ground left to worship your grandmother on anymore. We gave it to Brad to build a real legacy." Chloe burst into a cruel, triumphant laugh, her confidence instantly returning. "That is right, Maya. Brad owns Big Mama's house now, and he is going to bulldoze that rotting piece of wood to the ground to build a parking garage. You have all the money in the world, but you cannot save the only thing you actually love. The air in the lobby grew thick and suffocating. Marcus, Patricia, Chloe, and Brad stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of toxicity, grinning at me like a pack of starving wolves who had finally drawn blood. They thought they had broken me. They thought this was the kill shot that would force me to my knees. They wanted me to break down in front of my own security team. They wanted me to beg them to spare the home where I spent my childhood summers baking peach cobbler and learning what real love felt like. My father stood there puffing out his chest, believing he had just reasserted his dominance as the patriarch. He honestly believed he had put the rebellious daughter back in her place by selling out his own mother's legacy to a man who barely respected him. I stared directly into Brad's pale, gloating eyes. He crossed his arms over his chest, rocking back on his heels, thoroughly enjoying the power trip of holding my family's history hostage. He thought he was the ultimate businessman. He thought he was untouchable. He had no earthly idea that he had just walked himself directly into a financial slaughterhouse. Brad stepped forward, wrapping a possessive arm around Chloe's waist and flashing me a smile that absolutely dripped with unearned superiority. He looked down at me from his 6'2" frame, seemingly convinced that his mere physical presence was enough to intimidate me into silence. This was the exact dynamic my parents worshipped. They bowed down to Brad because he projected the kind of arrogant corporate whiteness they believed would legitimize our family in the eyes of Atlanta's high society. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya." Brad drawled, his voice loud enough to echo off the marble pillars of the lobby. "This is how the real world operates. Land is an asset. It is meant to generate revenue. You cannot hold on to a dilapidated piece of wood just because your grandmother used to bake pies there. Real estate development is about maximizing capital and having the vision to build an empire. That is a concept my family has understood and profited from for generations. Your side of the family is entirely too emotional and attached to the past. It is exactly why people like you stay at the bottom of the financial food chain, while people like me build the city skyline." Chloe nodded eagerly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He is right, Maya." Brad secured a massive multi-million-dollar commercial loan to develop that property. "We are going to build a luxury parking garage and retail space. It is going to bring our family millions. You should be thanking him for elevating the Jackson family name instead of throwing a tantrum in your pajamas." My mother Patricia chimed in, stepping out from behind my father. "Brad is a blessing to this family. He knows how to multiply our blessings. You could learn a thing or two from him if you were not so incredibly bitter." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact with Brad. I simply let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I took a deliberate step toward him, closing the distance until I was standing well within his personal space. I watched the initial flicker of confusion cross his pale eyes. "A visionary," I stated softly, my tone completely devoid of warmth. "You consider yourself a financial visionary, Brad. Is that what you told my gullible father when you convinced him to sign over the only piece of generational wealth this family actually owned?" Brad scoffed, puffing out his chest. "I did not convince him of anything. I presented a foolproof business plan. I secured the capital. I took the risk." "You secured a hard money loan," I corrected him, my voice turning razor sharp. "A high-risk, unregulated commercial bridge loan from a shadow lender, because absolutely zero reputable federally insured banks would touch your fraudulent business plan with a 10-foot pole." "Tell me, Brad, did you secure that loan from a firm called Apex Capital Solutions?" Brad stiffened. The smug, condescending smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. "How do you know the name of my lender?" he demanded, his tone dropping its arrogant lilt and adopting a sudden defensive edge. I ignored his question and took another step forward. "Did you actually read the fine print of the promissory note you signed, Brad?" Because a true real estate visionary would have noticed the 30% annualized interest rate. A true financial genius would have spotted the predatory default clauses hidden on page 42. And a man who claims to build empires would have realized that the loan was structured with a balloon payment completely designed to force a default within the first 90 days. My father, Marcus, frowned, looking back and forth between me and his son-in-law. What is she talking about, Brad? What 30% interest rate? You told me the loan was a standard commercial mortgage from a private backer. You said the terms were prime. Brad swallowed hard, a bead of sweat suddenly forming at his hairline. Shut up, Marcus! Brad snapped instantly, discarding the respectful son-in-law persona. She does not know what she is talking about. She is just trying to get under our skin. It is a standard bridge loan. I have it completely under control. You do not have a single thing under control, I fired back, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. You leveraged my parents' primary residence and my grandmother's historic home to secure $5 million in toxic debt. And instead of breaking ground on this imaginary retail space, you took the first $2 million disbursement and wired it directly to a private offshore account to cover your massive illicit gambling debts in Las Vegas. Chloe physically recoiled from Brad, her eyes widening in pure shock. Gambling debts! Chloe shrieked, grabbing his arm. Brad, what is she talking about? Where is the development money? Brad violently shook her hand off his arm. Shut your mouth, Chloe. She is lying. She is making this up to ruin us. I raised my hand, snapping my fingers once. The head concierge of my building, who had been watching the entire exchange with bated breath, immediately walked over and handed me a sleek black leather tablet case. I opened it and turned the high-resolution screen toward my family. I am not lying, I said, tapping the screen to bring up a series of highly classified banking statements. Here are the wire transfers. $2 million sent to the Bellagio Casino under a shell corporation registered in your name, and here is another $500,000 wired to a luxury condominium leasing office in Miami Beach. I am guessing Chloe does not know about the blonde 20-something Pilates instructor you have been paying rent for over the last 8 months. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. She lunged at Brad, her manicured hands turning into claws as she struck his chest. You are paying for a mistress. You mortgaged my parents' house for a mistress. Patricia grabbed her chest, stumbling backward against the velvet sofa. Marcus caught her, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. The realization of what he had done, the realization that he had sacrificed his own mother's sacred home to a white con artist who was actively bankrupting and betraying his daughter, crashed down on him like a physical blow. Marcus looked at Brad with pure, unadulterated horror. You promised me, Marcus choked out, his voice trembling with the weight of his catastrophic failure. You promised me this would elevate the family. You said the paperwork was just a formality. Brad pushed Chloe away roughly, his face completely devoid of its former superiority. He looked like a cornered animal. It does not matter, Brad yelled, his voice cracking with panic. It does not matter what I spent the initial disbursement on. The loan is secure. I hold the deeds. I will get the next round of funding and build the project. You cannot touch me, Maya. You are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to cause drama. I slowly closed the leather tablet case and handed it back to the concierge. I looked Brad dead in the eye, watching the sheer terror masquerading as rage bubbling beneath his skin. You are incredibly stupid, Brad, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded total silence in the lobby. You really should have done your due diligence before you signed your life away. You see, Apex Capital Solutions is not an independent lending firm. It is a subsidiary acquisition vehicle. It is a predatory lending arm designed specifically to absorb the toxic assets of over-leveraged, incompetent developers, just like you. Brad froze. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and uneven. And if you had bothered to trace the corporate ownership of Apex Capital Solutions, I continued, taking one final triumphant step toward him, you would have discovered that it is entirely owned, operated, and funded by Vanguard Holdings. The air in the lobby turned to absolute ice. The color completely vanished from Brad's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I am the bank, Brad, I stated, savoring every single syllable. I am the shadow lender who approved your fraudulent application. I am the one holding the 30% interest note. And because you explicitly violated the terms of the loan by transferring the development funds to cover personal gambling debts and a Miami mistress, you are officially in breach of contract. As the CEO of Vanguard Holdings, I executed the default clause at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands. Marcus sank onto the sofa beside her, completely defeated, his grand patriarchal authority stripped away in a matter of minutes. Chloe was hyperventilating, staring at Brad, as if he had just transformed into a monster right before her eyes. "You cannot do this," Brad gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. "You cannot just call the loan. I will lose everything. The bank will seize the properties." "The bank has already seized the properties." I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "I now legally own my parents' primary residence. I legally own Big Mama's house. And because you signed a personal guarantee on the loan, I legally own every single asset attached to your name. Your leased Porsche, your joint bank accounts with my sister, and the remaining balance of the stolen funds. You do not have a single dime to your name, Brad. You are entirely, irreversibly bankrupt." Brad fell to his knees right there on the cold marble floor of my lobby. The arrogant, condescending white savior of the Jackson family was now a blubbering, broken mess at my feet. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his hands clasped together in a pathetic display of submission. "Please, Maya," Brad begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Please do not do this. I will pay it back. I will find investors. I will sign Big Mama's house back over to you right now. Just give me time. Do not ruin my life. I am begging you." I looked down at him with absolute disgust. "You thought you could walk into my city, manipulate my desperate parents, steal my grandmother's legacy, and laugh in my face about it. You thought your privilege made you invincible. You thought you could bulldoze my history to build a parking garage." "Please," Brad sobbed, grabbing the hem of my silk robe. "I will do anything, anything." I pulled my robe out of his grasp and stepped back, looking at the completely shattered remains of my family. My mother was weeping uncontrollably. My father was staring blankly at the floor. My sister was trembling with rage and humiliation. They had chosen this man over me. They had sold their souls for the illusion of status, and now they had to pay the ultimate price. I looked back down at Brad. "You have exactly 10 minutes to leave my building before I have my security team physically throw you into the street," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "And you might want to run, Brad, because I did not just call the loan. I forwarded every single piece of your fraudulent financial documentation, including the wire transfers to your offshore gambling accounts, directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. They are probably knocking on your office door right now." Brad let out a guttural cry of pure terror. He scrambled to his feet, slipping on the slick marble floor, and bolted toward the revolving glass doors without looking back. He abandoned his wife, he abandoned my parents, and he ran out into the busy Atlanta street like a hunted animal. I turned my attention to Patricia, Marcus, and Chloe, who were now staring at me as if I were the Grim Reaper himself. The tables had completely turned. The prodigal daughter they had mocked, starved, and discarded was now the only thing standing between them and absolute destitution. The words echoed off the high marble ceilings of my lobby. "You do not have a single inch of ground left to worship your grandmother on anymore." The air in the room seemed to evaporate. My mother, Patricia, let out a breath she had been holding, her shoulders relaxing as a triumphant, vindictive smile crept across her face. They genuinely believed this was the killing blow. They thought they had finally broken me. Brad stepped forward, closing the distance between us. He slid a possessive, heavy arm around Chloe's waist, pulling her tightly against his side. He looked down at me from his 6'2" frame, his eyes dripping with that specific brand of arrogant, unearned white privilege. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, a suit I knew for a fact was bought on clearance and tailored to look expensive, and he offered me a smile of profound, patronizing pity. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," Brad drawled, his voice loud enough to make sure the building's security guards could hear him. "This is how the real world operates. You have been playing dress-up in this fancy building, but you do not understand the first thing about actual wealth. Land is an asset. It is meant to generate revenue. You cannot hold on to a dilapidated piece of wood in a run-down neighborhood just because your grandmother used to bake pies there. I stood perfectly still, letting him dig his own grave. Real estate development is about maximizing capital and having the vision to build an empire. Brad continued lecturing me as if I were a slow child. That is a concept my family has understood and profited from for generations. Your side of the family is entirely too emotional and attached to the past. It is exactly why people like you stay at the bottom of the financial food chain. Us white folks do not cling to poor heritage sites just to stand around crying over the past. We bulldoze the decay. We build the future. We build capital. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. He was standing in the lobby of a luxury high-rise that I owned, explaining capitalism to me while openly disrespecting the very foundation of my family's heritage. And the most sickening part was not Brad's blatant racism. It was the fact that my own parents were nodding along in agreement. Patricia and Marcus were practically salivating over his every word. They worshipped his whiteness and his supposed corporate success so blindly that they were willing to let him erase the only piece of true generational wealth my grandmother had worked her entire life to secure. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She leaned her head against Brad's shoulder, looking at me with pure disdain. You really thought you were doing something today, did you not, Maya? You put on a nice silk robe and thought you could outsmart my husband. Brad is a visionary. He secured a massive multi-million-dollar commercial loan to develop that property. We are going to build a luxury parking garage and a high-end retail space right over Big Mama's old garden. It is going to bring our family millions. You should be thanking him for elevating the Jackson family name instead of throwing a tantrum. Chloe is right, Patricia chimed in, stepping out from behind my father, her chest puffed out with manufactured pride. Brad is a blessing to this family. He knows how to multiply our blessings. You could learn a thing or two from him if you were not so incredibly bitter and jealous of your sister's success. They waited for my reaction. They expected me to scream. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg them not to destroy the house where I had spent my childhood summers, the only place where I had ever felt safe and loved. They wanted to see me break. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I reached out to a small side table next to the concierge desk, where I had placed my glass of deep red vintage wine before the confrontation escalated. I picked up the crystal glass by the stem. I swirled the dark crimson liquid, slowly watching it coat the sides of the glass in a smooth, hypnotic motion. I let a long, agonizing silence stretch between us. I wanted them to feel the shift in the atmosphere. I wanted them to feel the exact moment the ground beneath their feet began to crumble. I took a deliberate step toward Brad, looking him dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. A visionary, I stated softly, my tone completely devoid of any warmth. You consider yourself a financial visionary, Brad? Is that what you told my gullible father when you convinced him to sign over the deed to the only debt-free property this family actually owned? Brad scoffed, though I noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw. I did not convince him of anything. I presented a foolproof business plan. I secured the capital. I took the risk. I am the one doing the heavy lifting. You secured a hard money loan, I corrected him, my voice turning razor-sharp and cutting through his bravado like a knife. You did not go to a reputable federally insured bank. You could not, because no legitimate financial institution on this planet would ever touch your fraudulent, half-baked business plan with a 10-foot pole. You have zero liquid assets, Brad. Your credit score is a joke, so you went to a shadow lender. My father, Marcus, frowned deeply. He looked back and forth between me and his son-in-law. What is she talking about, Brad? What shadow lender? You told me the loan was a standard commercial mortgage from a private backer. You said the terms were prime and the risk was entirely covered. Brad swallowed hard. He pulled his arm away from Chloe's waist and squared his shoulders, trying desperately to maintain his facade of superiority. Shut up, Marcus! Brad snapped instantly, discarding the respectful son-in-law persona he had been playing all morning. Do not listen to her. She does not know what she is talking about. She is just trying to get under our skin because she is broke and jealous. It is a standard bridge loan. I have it completely under control. You do not have a single thing under control, I fired back, taking another step forward until I was standing well within his personal space. The smell of his cheap cologne hit my nose and I smiled coldly. You leveraged my parents' primary residence and my grandmother's historic home to secure $5 million in toxic debt. You promised them a luxury retail space. But building requires actual work, does it not? Chloe grabbed Brad's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Brad, what is she saying? The development money is secure, right? I did not let Brad answer. I kept my eyes locked directly on his rapidly paling face. Is that how you do business, Brad? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper that demanded total silence in the lobby. Because a true real estate visionary would have done a little bit of background research on the people lending him millions of dollars. A true financial genius would have read the fine print. I tilted my head, swirling the wine one last time before taking a slow, calculated sip. Tell me, Brad, I said, offering him a smile that was absolute ice. Did you actually read the name of the financial company that gave you that hard money loan? Did you happen to notice the predatory 30% annualized interest rate hidden in the addendum? Did you see the balloon payment clause entirely designed to force an immediate default? Brad froze completely. His breathing stopped. His eyes widened as the devastating reality of my words began to penetrate his thick skull. He was finally starting to realize that something was terribly catastrophically wrong. By 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the top floor of the Vanguard Holdings Tower was absolutely electric. I sat behind my custom marble desk in my glass-walled executive office, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The morning sun reflected off the skyscrapers, painting the city in shades of gold and copper. This was my kingdom. I built every single inch of it from the ground up, while my family was busy whispering prayers for my supposedly ruined soul. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, relishing the absolute quiet of my domain. Down in the lobby of my corporate headquarters, the situation was anything but quiet. My intercom buzzed with a sharp, crisp tone. It was David, my head of corporate security. He informed me that a highly agitated Caucasian male, matching Brad's description, was currently causing a massive scene at the front reception desk. Brad was sweating profusely, demanding to speak to the chief executive officer, and threatening to call the police if he was not granted immediate access to the top floor. He had spent his entire Sunday frantically digging through state business registries and corporate tax filings. The sheer panic of impending federal prison time must have fueled an all-night research binge. He finally traced the shell companies. He followed the paper trail from Apex Capital Solutions directly up to the parent company Vanguard Holdings. And there, at the very top of the corporate ladder, he found my name. I smiled at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. I pressed the intercom button and told David to send him up. I wanted Brad to see it. I wanted him to walk through the mahogany double doors and witness the sheer scale of the empire he thought he was better than. I moved from my private office into the main executive conference room. It was a massive, intimidating space designed specifically to make opposing negotiators feel small. The table was carved from a single slab of black obsidian. I took my seat at the very head of the table, folding my hands perfectly still. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open with violent force. Brad stumbled inside, accompanied by two of my security guards who flanked him like imposing shadows. The man standing before me was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, swaggering real estate developer who had tried to humiliate me at the steakhouse just 48 hours ago. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. His tie was yanked down around his neck. His face was blotchy and pale, and his eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation. Brad looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from the expensive modern art on the walls to the panoramic view of the city. He looked at the security guards, and then his gaze finally locked onto me. He was standing in a $50 million corporate suite owned entirely by the black woman he had called a lowly bookkeeper. The reality of his absolute defeat was crashing down on him, but his toxic pride refused to let him surrender gracefully. Instead of apologizing, instead of begging for mercy, like a rational person facing federal indictment, Brad resorted to the only weapon he had left. He tried to use his aggression to bully his way out of a financial death sentence. He stepped forward, shaking off the security guards. He slammed both of his hands down onto the black obsidian table, leaning toward me with a desperate, wild look in his eyes. "You tricked me!" Brad roared, his voice echoing harshly against the glass walls. "You set me up. I am going to sue you for financial fraud." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, letting his pathetic threat dissolve into the absolute silence of the room. The two massive security guards standing just inches behind him immediately shifted their weight, ready to pin him to the floor for raising his voice at me. I raised a single finger. They stopped instantly, stepping back, but keeping their eyes locked on his every twitch. I did not need physical force to destroy Brad. I was about to dismantle his entire existence with pure, indisputable data. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply stared at the pulsing vein on his forehead, watching his sheer terror masquerade as outrage. "Sue me," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue as if tasting something incredibly bland. "You are threatening to sue the very institution holding your debt. That is a bold strategy for a man who is currently drowning in his own incompetence." I reached out and pressed a single silver button embedded in the surface of my black obsidian desk. Instantly, the heavy motorized blackout blinds began to descend, sealing off the panoramic view of the bright Atlanta skyline. The massive glass-walled office was plunged into a suffocating heavy twilight. A high-definition projector hummed to life overhead, casting a blinding, crisp white rectangle onto the far wall of the conference room. Brad stumbled back a half step, the sudden darkness throwing him off balance. His bravado was fracturing by the second. He looked wildly around the darkened room, the glowing white light reflecting in his wide, panicked eyes. "You cannot sue the bank for executing a standard default clause on a breached contract, Brad," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. "Especially not when your entire commercial real estate project is nothing more than a pathetic, horribly structured Ponzi scheme." "That is a lie!" Brad stammered, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I have permits. I have contractors lined up. I have a legitimate business plan. My company is fully incorporated. You are just trying to intimidate me because you are jealous of my position in your family." I tapped a command onto the digital console on my desk. The projector screen flashed, displaying a highly detailed, itemized commercial bank statement. I highlighted specific rows in bright, undeniable crimson. "You have absolutely nothing," I countered, standing up slowly. I walked around the massive obsidian table, the click of my heels sounding like a metronome counting down the final seconds of his fraudulent life. I stopped just a few feet away from him, letting my presence loom over his trembling frame. "You secured a $5 million hard money loan against my family's properties. The contract you blindly signed without consulting a real corporate attorney stipulated that the initial $2 million disbursement was strictly earmarked for zoning demolition and foundational construction on my grandmother's land. But you did not hire a single contractor. You did not secure a single city permit. You did not even order a land survey." Brad swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He looked at the bank routing numbers projected on the wall, and the color completely drained from his face. "You hacked my accounts," he breathed out, his voice barely a whisper. "This is an invasion of privacy. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." "I am your lender, Brad," I reminded him, enjoying the sheer panic radiating from his body. "I have full legal access to the escrow accounts you used to funnel the money. And you were incredibly, shockingly sloppy." I swiped my finger across the tablet in my hand, advancing the slide on the projector. A new set of documents appeared: wire transfer receipts, casino ledgers, private banking statements from institutions far outside the state of Georgia. "You did not build a single thing on Big Mama's land," I continued, my tone turning lethal. "You took the first $2 million from the loan disbursement and you wired it directly to a shell corporation registered under your personal name in Nevada." From there, you funneled the cash straight into the VIP high roller accounts at the Bellagio and the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Brad shook his head violently, holding his hands up as if he could physically push the projected images away. No, those were business expenses. I was entertaining potential corporate investors. I was securing additional capital to expand the retail project. You do not understand how high-level real estate networking operates. You lost $1.2 million playing high-stakes baccarat in a span of just 3 weeks, I stated, completely dismantling his pathetic excuse. The casino comps, the wire transfer requests, and the losing streak algorithms are all right there on the screen behind you. You are not a real estate visionary, Brad. You are a degenerate gambling addict who used my parents' desperate need for white validation to bankroll your addiction. You used their pathological desire to be associated with your skin color, to steal their home. He opened his mouth to argue, but his voice completely failed him. He was suffocating under the weight of the evidence. But I was not finished breaking him. I had one more card to play, and it was the one that would guarantee his absolute destruction. But that is not even the best part, I said, tapping the screen one final time. The casino ledgers vanished from the wall. In their place appeared a crystal-clear high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of a stunning oceanfront luxury condominium building in Miami Beach. The next slide showed the property deed, heavily highlighted. The slide after that showed a candid, undeniably intimate photograph of Brad wrapping his arms around a blonde woman in her early 20s, kissing her cheek on the balcony of that exact condominium. Brad let out a strangled, agonizing gasp. His chest heaved as if the oxygen had just been sucked directly out of his lungs. You took the remaining $800,000 from the initial loan disbursement, I said, staring down at him with pure, unadulterated disgust, and you bought a luxury condo in cash for your blonde mistress in Miami. You have been paying her monthly maintenance fees, funding her designer shopping sprees, and covering her private Pilates sessions, using the equity stolen directly from my grandmother's home. Please, Brad wheezed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. Maya, please, you cannot show this to Chloe. You cannot show this to your parents. You looked my father in the eye and promised him a legacy. I continued showing him absolutely zero mercy. You smiled at my sister and promised her a financial empire. You sat at our family dinner table acting like you were a god walking among peasants, mocking my career and my intelligence. And the entire time you were bleeding my family dry to fund your secret double life and your gambling addiction. You took everything they had. The remaining fragments of Brad's arrogant, entitled facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of his situation finally crushed him. His legs completely gave out. He collapsed hard onto the polished floor of my conference room, the sound of his knees hitting the hardwood echoing sharply in the dark room. He fell to his hands and knees, staring at the floor, breathing heavily like a hunted animal that had just realized it was permanently trapped. I stood over him, watching the complete physical collapse of a man who had built his entire identity on unearned arrogance. From my vantage point, looking down at his trembling shoulders and the sweat soaking through his expensive dress shirt, Brad looked astonishingly small. The commanding, booming presence he had projected at the steakhouse and in the lobby of my penthouse had completely evaporated. He was no longer the brilliant real estate developer or the white savior my parents worshipped. He was just a thief who had finally been caught. Brad let out a ragged, choking sob. He did not try to stand up. He did not try to reclaim his dignity. Instead, he crawled forward on the polished hardwood floor, closing the distance between us, until he was mere inches from my designer heels. He reached out with shaking hands, hovering just above my ankles, too terrified to actually touch me but desperate for any kind of connection. Maya, please. Brad wept, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, agonizing whine that echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. I am begging you. You cannot show those pictures to Chloe. You cannot tell Marcus and Patricia about Miami. They will ruin me. Chloe will take everything in the divorce. Marcus will literally kill me. I looked down at his tear-stained, blotchy face with absolute disgust. He was not crying because he felt guilty for stealing my grandmother's house. He was not crying because he felt remorse for bankrupting my parents. He was crying solely because he had been caught. You are worried about Chloe taking everything in a divorce, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Brad, you do not have anything left to take. I already own it all. I own the cars, the bank accounts, and the properties. Chloe cannot take half of zero. He frantically shook his head, tears dripping from his chin onto the pristine floor. No, no, you do not understand. I can fix this. I can make this right. Just give me the deeds back. Let me restructure the loan. I will sign anything you want. I will sign a confession. I will work for you. I will be your slave, Maya. I will do whatever you tell me to do forever. Just please keep the mistress a secret. Keep the gambling a secret. I will give you whatever you want. He was practically hyperventilating, bargaining with currency he did not possess. I took a slow, deliberate step back, forcing him to look up at me from a sharper, more humiliating angle. You think I want you working for me? I scoffed, letting the full weight of my contempt wash over him. You think I want a grossly incompetent, fraudulent addict anywhere near my multi-billion-dollar private equity firm? You could not even manage a simple demolition permit without funneling the cash to a casino floor. You are a liability, Brad. You are financial poison. He scrambled forward again, his palms sliding on the sleek floor. Then, let me handle Chloe and Marcus, he pleaded, his voice reaching a new level of pathetic desperation. I will tell them the project failed because of the market. I will convince them to walk away quietly. You know how they listen to me. You know they hang on to my every word. I can manipulate them for you, Maya. I can make them stop bothering you. I will convince them to leave you alone forever. Just give me the paperwork. Give me the photos of the Miami condo. We can make a deal. We are family. The sheer audacity of his words sent a cold, sharp thrill down my spine. He was willing to throw his own wife and his deeply loyal in-laws directly under the bus just to save his own skin. He was offering to manipulate the very people who had worshipped his whiteness and his fabricated wealth, treating them like disposable pawns. Family. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. You have the absolute nerve to use that word in my office. Yesterday, you stood in my lobby and mocked my heritage. You laughed at the idea of my grandmother's legacy. You looked my father in the eye and proudly announced that you were going to bulldoze the only piece of true generational wealth my family had ever secured. You told me that people like you build empires while people like me stay at the bottom of the food chain. Brad squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head frantically. I did not mean it. I was just angry. I was just trying to protect my image. You know how Marcus is. He demands perfection. I had to put on a show for him. I had to make him respect me. Do not blame my father for your grotesque sense of entitlement. I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. Marcus has his own deep-seated issues, but you played on his insecurities. You recognized his desperate need for high society validation, and you weaponized it. You walked into our family, used your skin color as a VIP pass to gain his absolute trust, and then you bled him dry. You took the house that my grandmother scrubbed floors for 50 years to pay off, and you traded it for a blonde Pilates instructor in Miami and a stack of losing casino chips. I walked back over to my massive obsidian desk, leaving him groveling on the floor. I did not sit down. I stood behind the desk, resting my fingertips lightly on the cool, polished surface. I can get the money back, Brad sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically across the vast room. I have a buddy in commercial real estate in Chicago. He owes me a favor. I can get a bridge loan to cover your 30% interest. I can pay you back every single cent. Just give me 48 hours. Please, Maya. If the public finds out about this, my reputation in Atlanta is finished. No one will ever do business with me again. I stared at him, watching the last remnants of his arrogance dissolve into a puddle of pure, unadulterated cowardice. He still thought this was a negotiation. He still believed that because he had always talked his way out of trouble in the past, he could charm or beg his way out of a corporate execution. I reached down and picked up the heavy, sleek receiver of my desk phone. I am not going to tell Chloe about your Miami mistress, Brad, I said softly. Brad stopped crying for a fraction of a second. A tiny, foolish glimmer of hope sparked in his bloodshot eyes. He looked up, his breathing hitching in his throat. "You mean it," he whispered. "You will keep it quiet." "I am not going to tell Marcus about your Vegas gambling debts either." I continued, my gaze locked onto his terrified face. "I am not going to call a family meeting. I am not going to embarrass you in front of the church congregation. I am not going to waste a single breath explaining your pathetic betrayals to my parents." Brad let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. He actually wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. "Oh, thank God. Thank you, Maya. Thank you. I swear to you I will make this right. I will pay you back. I will never bother you again." I held the phone receiver loosely in my hand. "You are not going to pay me back, Brad. And you are certainly never going to bother me again. Because I did not just call the loan this morning." The hope vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "I sent the entire portfolio of your fraudulent transactions to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. Last Thursday, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. I gave them the offshore routing numbers. I gave them the fake invoices you generated to justify the loan disbursements. I gave them the deed to the Miami condo you bought with stolen funds. I handed them a perfectly wrapped, indisputable case of wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion." Brad let out a guttural, horrifying sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man realizing his life was officially over. He scrambled backward on the hardwood floor, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors of the conference room. "No," Brad gasped, his chest heaving violently. "No, you did not. You are bluffing. You would not bring the feds into this. They will seize everything. They will freeze your parents' assets too." "My parents signed away their assets the moment they handed you the deeds," I corrected him effortlessly. "I already secured the titles under Vanguard Holdings before the feds even opened the file. My assets are protected. Yours are currently being liquidated by the federal government." I checked the diamond-encrusted watch on my wrist. "My head of corporate security just received a phone call from the lobby," I said, looking back down at him. 3 black SUVs just pulled up to the front entrance of this building. There are currently 6 federal agents stepping into the lobby elevators. "They have a federal warrant for your arrest, Brad." Brad scrambled to his feet. He slipped on the polished floor, crashing his knee hard against the base of a leather chair, but he did not even cry out in pain. Pure animalistic adrenaline had completely taken over his body. "You have exactly 10 minutes before they reach the top floor," I announced, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "You have 10 minutes to run before they put you in handcuffs and drag you out of this building in front of every major financial executive in Atlanta." He did not say another word. He did not beg. He did not negotiate. Brad turned and bolted. He slammed his shoulder into the heavy glass doors of the conference room, shoving them open with violent force. He sprinted down the executive hallway, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the marble tiles. He was running toward the emergency stairwell, desperate to avoid the main elevators where the federal agents were undoubtedly waiting. I stood behind my desk, holding the phone receiver, listening to the heavy, frantic thud of his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they completely disappeared. He was running for his life, leaving behind a trail of financial devastation and a shattered family that had worshipped the very ground he walked on. I slowly placed the receiver back onto its base. The silence returned to my office, heavy and deeply satisfying. Brad was gone, but the true reckoning with my family had only just begun. 4 days passed since Brad sprinted out of my corporate tower. 4 days of absolute, deafening silence from my parents. Brad had completely vanished into the wind, abandoning his leased Porsche in a downtown parking deck, while federal agents methodically froze every single bank account attached to his name. My father and my sister Chloe were desperately trying to reach him, completely ignorant of the fact that he was currently a fugitive running from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But my mother Patricia was never one to let a catastrophic family crisis get in the way of a highly publicized social event. Friday evening brought the annual Legacy Endowment Gala at one of the most prominent affluent black megachurches in Atlanta. For my mother, this massive cathedral was not just a place of worship. It was her personal kingdom. It was the ultimate stage where she paraded her curated, flawless family image in front of city council members, wealthy local business owners, and the high society elite. She thrived on the validation of the congregation. Her standing in the church hierarchy was the air she breathed, and she would protect that manufactured image at all costs. I sat in the back of my chauffeured black SUV parked discreetly across the street from the soaring, stained glass windows of the cathedral. Through the tinted glass, I watched the city elite pour into the building dressed in their finest tailored suits and elaborate designer gowns. I knew exactly what was happening inside. Chloe had undoubtedly spent the last 4 days crying to our parents about how I had unfairly frozen Brad out of his own projects out of sheer malicious jealousy. And Patricia refusing to believe she had handed her own mother's legacy to a white con artist chose the narrative that protected her fragile ego. She chose to believe I was the villain. I stepped out of the vehicle into the warm evening air. I was not wearing my usual dark corporate attire. Tonight, I wore a striking, impeccably tailored, pristine white power suit. It was a deliberate choice. It was a statement of absolute authority, clarity, and control. I was flanked by David, my head of corporate security, and another massive, highly trained bodyguard. We walked up the wide marble steps of the cathedral in perfect unison. As I entered the grand, softly lit vestibule, the heavy mahogany doors leading into the main sanctuary were closed, but the state-of-the-art audio system broadcast every single word being spoken inside. I stood in the foyer, my security team standing silently behind me, and I listened to my mother perform the greatest acting job of her entire life. Patricia was standing at the crystal podium at the front of the massive sanctuary. Her voice trembled with perfectly practiced emotion echoing through the speakers and washing over the hundreds of wealthy donors seated in the velvet pews. Brothers and sisters, my mother projected her tone dripping with manufactured sorrow. We gather tonight to celebrate community and uplift one another. But tonight, I must ask for your deepest prayers for my own family. As many of you know, my husband and I have always strived to lead by example. We welcomed a wonderful son-in-law, Brad, into our family. A brilliant, generous man who wanted nothing more than to build a community center on the very land my late mother left us. He wanted to bring jobs and prosperity to our neighborhood. A low murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the congregation. I crossed my arms, staring at the closed wooden doors, my jaw clenching at the sheer audacity of her lies. But the devil works in mysterious ways, Patricia continued, her voice rising in a dramatic theatrical cadence. I stand before you a heartbroken mother. My youngest daughter, Maya, who strayed from the righteous path years ago when she dropped out of medical school, has returned to us with darkness in her heart. She fell into a world of greedy, ruthless finance. And this week, driven by deep-seated jealousy and bitterness toward her sister's happiness, Maya used her shady corporate connections to illegally sabotage Brad's development project. She froze his accounts. She halted the construction of our community center. She launched a vicious financial attack on her own flesh and blood just to exact some petty childhood revenge. The congregation gasped collectively. I could hear the loud, judgmental whispers erupting from the front rows all the way to the balcony. Women my mother played cards with were shaking their heads, muttering prayers for my supposedly lost soul. Patricia was successfully weaponizing the faith and sympathy of hundreds of people, painting Brad as a selfless martyr and branding me as a demonic, money-hungry force intent on destroying my own family. My daughter has lost her way, Patricia cried out, producing a lace handkerchief and dabbing at her completely dry eyes. She has chosen cold, hard cash over the love of her parents. She has tried to ruin a good, honest man who only wanted to elevate our family name. I ask you all tonight to pray for Maya's salvation, and I ask you to support our family's new legal fund so we can fight these false corporate attacks and reclaim the land that rightfully belongs to our visionary son-in-law. She was actually using my grandmother's stolen house to solicit donations from the church. The absolute depravity of her actions extinguished whatever tiny, lingering shred of familial loyalty I had left. She was willing to publicly crucify her own daughter to protect the fragile illusion of her social status. and to defend a white fraudster who was currently hiding from the federal government. I turned my head slightly and gave David a single sharp nod. David and the second security guard stepped forward. They placed their hands on the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors leading into the sanctuary. With one synchronized powerful shove, they pushed the doors wide open. The heavy wood hit the stoppers with a resounding, thunderous boom that echoed like a gunshot all the way up to the vaulted ceilings of the cathedral. The entire congregation flinched. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the back of the sanctuary in perfect unison. The loud, sympathetic murmurs died instantly in their throats. The organist, who had been playing soft, emotional background music to accompany my mother's tears, abruptly stopped with a discordant crash of keys. I stood framed in this massive doorway, the bright lights of the vestibule casting a brilliant glowing halo around my pristine white suit. I looked down the long, red-carpeted center aisle, my eyes locking directly onto my mother, who was still clutching the microphone at the crystal podium. Patricia completely froze. The lace handkerchief dropped from her trembling fingers and fluttered silently to the stage floor. Her face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked as if she had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. Next to her, sitting in the front row of honor, my father Marcus and my sister Chloe turned around. Their eyes widened in absolute shock. I did not rush. I did not run. I began to walk down the center aisle with slow, rhythmic, highly calculated steps. My heels clicked sharply against the polished wood beneath the red carpet, cutting through the suffocating silence of the massive room. My two heavily armed security guards walked one step behind me, their imposing presence radiating a lethal, untouchable authority. The congregation parted like the Red Sea. Deacons, city councilmen, and wealthy socialites stared at me in stunned fascination. They had just been told I was a broken, bitter dropout hiding in the shadows of shady finance. Instead, they were watching a powerful multimillionaire chief executive officer stride into their sanctuary like an absolute conqueror. I kept my eyes locked on Patricia the entire time. I watched her grip the edges of the crystal podium so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She looked frantically toward the side exits, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, but she was trapped. She was standing on the very stage she had built to destroy me completely, surrounded by the audience she had just lied to. I reached the front of the sanctuary, stopping just a few feet away from the elevated stage. The silence in the room was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the stage lights overhead. Every single person in that cathedral was holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. I looked up at my mother, offering her a cold, terrifying smile that promised absolute destruction. I was not there to argue. I was not there to defend myself against her pathetic lies. I was there to execute the final devastating chapter of her downfall in front of the entire city. The heavy silence in the sanctuary shattered the moment my father decided his patriarchal pride was more important than common sense. Marcus sprang from his front row pew, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He could not stand the sight of me walking down his church aisle like I owned the ground beneath my feet. In his mind, I was still the disobedient teenager he could physically intimidate into submission, the scapegoat he could strike to maintain his absolute authority. He charged toward me, his tailored Sunday suit pulling tight across his shoulders. He raised his right hand high into the air, fully intending to slap me across the face in front of 500 people to put me back in my place and restore his shattered dominance. I did not even blink. I did not break my stride. Before Marcus could even bring his hand down, David moved. My head of security stepped smoothly in front of me, catching my father's wrist midair with lightning speed. With one fluid, highly trained motion, David twisted my father's arm sharply behind his back. He applied just enough pressure to force the great prideful Marcus Jackson to his knees, right there on the red carpet. The sound of my father's knees hitting the hardwood floor echoed like a gunshot. A collective gasp of absolute horror erupted from the congregation. Several deacons in the front rows jumped to their feet, their faces flashing with outrage at the sight of a prominent church member being manhandled. But my second security guard immediately stepped forward and placed a hand firmly over his suit jacket, a silent, unmistakable warning that kept every single man frozen in his pew. "Let him go!" Chloe shrieked from the front row, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at my security team. "How dare you touch him in the house of the Lord? Where is Brad? Brad will handle you. Just wait until my husband gets here." I did not even look at my sister. Her blind reliance on a white savior who was currently fleeing from federal agents was pathetic. I stepped gracefully around my kneeling, groaning father and ascended the plush-carpeted steps to the elevated altar. The crystal podium gleamed under the stage lights, but all I focused on was the woman gripping it. Patricia was vibrating with sheer terror. Up close, the flawless, pious facade she had projected to the congregation was completely gone. Sweat beaded on her forehead, threatening to ruin her expensive makeup, and the elaborate church hat she wore like a crown. Her knuckles were stark white as she clung to the microphone stand, treating it like a lifeline. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting frantically across the room, desperately searching the crowd for someone to intervene. But nobody moved. The sheer force of my presence had paralyzed the entire room. "Maya, please," Patricia hissed under her breath. Her voice was barely a frantic whisper meant only for my ears. "Do not do this. Not here. Not in front of the bishop. We can talk about this at home. Put your pride away. I am your mother. You have to respect your elders. Respect is earned." "Patricia, not extorted," I replied, my voice equally low but sharp as cracked glass. "And you stopped being my mother the day you stole my medical school tuition to fund your delusions of grandeur." I reached out and wrapped my hand firmly around the neck of the microphone. Patricia tried to resist. Her manicured fingers tightened around the metal, her eyes pleading with me to spare her reputation. But she had no real strength left. The sheer weight of her impending public ruin had already drained the life out of her. I ripped the microphone from her grasp with a sharp, definitive pull. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own designer heels, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically struck. She retreated into the shadows of the choir stand, shrinking away from the blinding stage lights. I turned to face the congregation. 500 faces stared back at me in absolute terrified fascination. The wealthy donors, the church elders, the women wearing their Sunday best who had just been bowing their heads and praying for my doomed soul. They were completely captivated by the hostile takeover of their sacred stage. I adjusted my pristine white blazer, making sure my posture was flawless. I projected the absolute authority of a billionaire corporate executive who had just conquered the room without breaking a single sweat. I brought the microphone to my lips. The state-of-the-art sound system amplified my breathing, ringing out crystal clear across the massive cathedral. "Good evening, everyone," I stated. My tone was smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria my mother had just utilized to manipulate them. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I know you were all deep in prayer for my salvation, but I figured I should save you the trouble and deliver the truth directly to the source." A pin-drop silence held the room captive. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to cough. The tension was suffocating. "A few moments ago, the woman cowering behind me stood at this very podium and told you a tragic, heartbreaking story," I continued. I began to pace slowly across the altar, commanding the entire width of the stage, just as I would in a corporate boardroom. "She told you that her youngest daughter was a bitter, jealous dropout who lost her way. She told you that I emerged from the shadows of shady finance to maliciously destroy her innocent, visionary son-in-law. She stood in front of this holy congregation, shed fake tears, and asked you to open your hard-earned checkbooks to donate to a legal defense fund. She asked you to finance the rescue of a community center that does not even exist." I paused, making direct eye contact with a prominent city councilman seated in the third row. He shifted uncomfortably under my piercing gaze, suddenly realizing he had almost written a massive check to a fraud. "I know you all love a good redemption story," I said, projecting my voice so it bounced off the vaulted ceilings and reached the very back of the balcony. "And I know how much this specific congregation values the appearance of a righteous, unified, successful family. My parents have weaponized that exact value for decades to hide their own toxic reality. So I am here to clarify the public record. Because the most fascinating part about my mother's tearful performance tonight is that she actually told you a fraction of the truth. Patricia let out a strangled, pathetic whimper from the shadows behind the podium. It was the sound of a woman realizing her social execution was inescapable. I ignored her completely. My mother is absolutely right, I announced, my voice booming with undeniable power. I did buy the family's debt. I am the shadow lender who pulled the plug on Brad's commercial loan. I am the sole reason the construction on Big Mama's land was halted before a single shovel touched the dirt. I looked down at Chloe in the front row. She was staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her arrogant smirk entirely erased, replaced by a dawning, horrific comprehension. But what my mother conveniently forgot to mention, and what she incredibly does not even know herself, is the exact nature of the financial contract she blindly co-signed to protect her precious social status. I continued, my words striking like hammer blows. You see, Brad never intended to build a community center. He never even applied for the local zoning permits. Your visionary white son-in-law needed capital, and he needed it fast to cover his catastrophic gambling debts in Las Vegas. But because no legitimate federally insured bank would ever touch his fraudulent business model, he came crawling to a predatory lending firm. My lending firm. I took a deep breath, letting the anticipation build until the tension in the sanctuary was absolutely unbearable. I looked directly into the eyes of my father, who was still kneeling on the floor, his face drained of all blood. And to secure that massive $5 million loan, Brad did not just leverage the empty plot of land my grandmother left us. I stated, dropping the final devastating anvil onto their manufactured lives. Brad used the very mansion my parents currently live in as collateral to guarantee his ghost project. The entire congregation erupted into absolute chaos. The noise was deafening. Gasps, shouts, and frantic whispers filled the sacred space, echoing off the stained glass windows. My mother stumbled backward against the wooden railing of the choir stand, her hands flying up to cover her face as a guttural sob ripped from her throat. Chloe leaped up from the front pew, her face twisted in pure, desperate denial. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, screaming over the noise of the crowd that I was a bitter, jealous liar trying to ruin her perfect marriage. I did not argue with her. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. My executive assistant, who had been waiting quietly near the soundboard at the back of the sanctuary, plugged a single cable into her iPad. Instantly, the two massive high-definition screens mounted above the choir stand, the ones normally used to project scripture verses and hymn lyrics for the congregation, flickered to life. The glowing white light bathed the entire altar, casting harsh shadows across my mother's terrified face. On the massive screens, a crystal-clear image of the official promissory note appeared. I stepped aside so my mother, my father, and every single member of their beloved congregation could read the fine print. There, magnified for 500 people to see, were the signatures of Patricia and Marcus Jackson, placed right next to the signature of their precious son-in-law. The document clearly stated that their sprawling suburban mansion had been put up as collateral for a high-risk, unregulated commercial loan with a predatory 30% interest rate. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice slicing effortlessly through the chaotic murmurs of the church. The man you all just prayed for. The man my mother just called a visionary on this very stage took the first $2 million of this loan and wired it directly to high-roller casino accounts in Las Vegas, I announced, letting the sheer weight of the truth crush the air out of the room. He lost it all at the baccarat tables in less than 3 weeks. He never bought a single brick for your imaginary community center. He never even applied for the zoning permits. Chloe shook her head violently, hot tears ruining her expensive makeup. She ran up the carpeted steps and clawed at the edge of the crystal podium, screaming that I had fabricated the bank statements. She yelled that Brad was working day and night to provide for their family, that he was under immense corporate pressure, and that I was just a sad, lonely spinster trying to tear down a successful white businessman because I could not find a wealthy husband of my own. I looked down at my older sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my ambition and defending the very man who was actively destroying our family. I gave my assistant another subtle nod. The screens above us shifted instantly. The bank statements vanished. In their place appeared a massive high-resolution photograph of a sleek oceanfront luxury condominium in Miami Beach. A collective murmur of confusion washed over the pews. Then the next slide loaded automatically. It was a candid, undeniably clear photograph of Brad. He was standing on the sunlit balcony of that exact condominium, wrapping his arms around a blonde woman in her early 20s. He was kissing her deeply on the cheek, his hands resting possessively on her waist. The entire church let out a synchronized shriek of horror. The older women in the congregation covered their mouths in absolute shock. The church deacons lowered their heads in sheer disgrace. Chloe stopped screaming. Her entire body went completely rigid. Her hands dropped from the crystal podium. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow broken shell as she stared up at the massive, inescapable proof of her husband's betrayal. I projected my voice through the cathedral, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating surgical precision. Your perfect visionary husband took the remaining $800,000 from the loan. My parents blindly guaranteed, I stated, staring directly into Chloe's shattered eyes. And he bought a luxury condo in cash for his blonde mistress. He has been paying her monthly maintenance fees and covering her private Pilates sessions using the equity stolen directly from our parents' home. You married a parasite, Chloe. And our parents funded his infidelity just to keep up appearances. Chloe let out a sound that I had never heard before, a raw, primal wail of pure agony. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the plush red carpet of the altar, clutching her stomach as she sobbed uncontrollably. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy marriage was incinerated in front of the entire high society of Atlanta. I turned my attention away from my sobbing sister and looked back out at the congregation. Then I looked down at my father, Marcus, who was still kneeling on the floor, restrained by the crushing reality of his own catastrophic failure. The patriarch who had tried to strike me just moments ago was now completely stripped of his pride, his dignity, and his power. I gripped the microphone, my white suit glowing under the stage spotlights. I delivered the final crushing verdict. Brad is not a millionaire, Eigen Tong Chu, translating my absolute authority into a language they could not possibly misunderstand. He is a fraud. He is a degenerate gambler and a con artist who is currently fleeing from federal agents as we speak. And because my parents blindly co-signed a fraudulent document for a smooth-talking white man just to elevate their social standing in this very room, the loan went into absolute default. I looked right at Patricia, who was now curled into a fetal position on the floor of the choir stand, weeping hysterically as her carefully curated kingdom burned to ash around her. The financial firm that approved that predatory loan was a subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings. I announced the final piece of the puzzle, locking into place for everyone in the room. As the chief executive officer of Vanguard, my bank officially executed the default clause at 8 o'clock this morning. I am officially announcing the foreclosure of your assets. The mansion you live in and the historic land you stole from Big Mama now belong entirely to me. The illusion of Chloe's perfect marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. She let out a scream that did not even sound human. It was a visceral, ear-piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged at Brad with terrifying speed. Her perfectly manicured hands turned into claws as she struck his chest, slapped his face, and tore wildly at the lapels of his cheap suit. "You gave her my money!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking over the church audio system. "You mortgaged my parents' house for a 22-year-old Pilates instructor in Miami. You stole my life." Brad stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his arrogant white savior persona. He pushed Chloe hard, sending her crashing into the crystal podium. The heavy structure tipped over and shattered on the hardwood floor, sending sharp shards of glass flying across the altar. Chloe collapsed into the wreckage, sobbing hysterically, completely ignoring the bleeding cuts on her hands. Patricia watched, her golden child weeping in the glass, and her wealthy son-in-law cowering like a cornered rat. She realized the entire congregation, the city councilmen, and the wealthy donors were staring at her with absolute, unmasked disgust. Her carefully curated empire of church prestige was gone forever. Desperate to regain control and change the narrative, my mother resorted to her oldest, most reliable manipulation tactic. She let out a loud theatrical gasp, pressed the back of her hand to her forehead, and dramatically swooned backward. She fully expected Marcus or one of the deacons to rush forward and catch her. She expected the crowd to gasp in sympathy and rush to her aid. Instead, they just watched. Not a single person moved to help her. Patricia hit the hard wooden floor of the choir stand with a loud, ungraceful thud. She lay there peeking through her eyelashes, realizing with absolute horror that her audience had completely abandoned her. Even Marcus remained frozen on his knees, staring blankly at the projected image of Brad, kissing his mistress, utterly paralyzed by the crushing weight of his own financial ruin. Then the wail of sirens pierced the stifling tension of the sanctuary. The loud piercing blare grew louder by the second, accompanied by the flashing strobe of red and blue lights bleeding intensely through the towering stained glass windows. Brad froze in his tracks. The color drained from his face for the second time that night. He spun around, looking frantically toward the side exits of the church. It was too late. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the cathedral burst open with explosive force. Federal Bureau of Investigation. A commanding voice roared over the chaos of the room. Nobody move. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical vests, accompanied by fully uniformed Atlanta police officers, swarmed into the sanctuary. The congregation parted in sheer panic, scrambling out of the center aisle as the heavily armed agents marched directly toward the altar. The heavy rhythmic thud of their boots on the hardwood floors signaled the absolute end of Brad's fraudulent empire. Brad panicked. He turned and tried to scramble up the carpeted steps toward the choir loft, stepping right over my mother's supposedly unconscious body in a desperate bid to escape through the back corridors. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 massive federal agents tackled him hard against the wooden railing. They slammed him face first onto the floor, twisting his arms behind his back with practiced, brutal efficiency. Brad let out a loud, pathetic yelp of pain as his face smashed into the polished wood. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed clearly through the silent church. "You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, bank fraud, and federal tax evasion," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying easily to the very back of the balcony. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." The mighty real estate visionary was hauled roughly to his feet. His suit was torn, his tie was ripped, and a line of blood trickled from his split lip where he had hit the floor. He looked utterly pathetic. The agents grabbed him by the arms and began frog-marching him down the center aisle, parading him like a common criminal in front of the entire high society of Atlanta. As they dragged him past the exact spot where I stood in my pristine white suit, Brad dug his heels into the red carpet, forcing the agents to briefly halt. He turned his head toward me, his bloodshot eyes burning with absolute rabid hatred. "You think you won?" Brad snarled, spitting the words at me like venom. "You are still just a bitter, lonely dropout. My lawyers will tear your shady little lending firm apart. I will be out on bail by midnight. You have not broken me, Maya." I did not flinch. I calmly raised my hand, signaling my security team to step back and give me a few inches of space. I leaned in very close, bringing my face right next to his ear. I kept my voice so quiet and steady that only he could hear the absolute finality in my words. "Your lawyers cannot help you, Brad," I whispered softly, "because your blonde mistress in Miami flipped on you. She handed the FBI your encrypted hard drive yesterday morning in exchange for total federal immunity. She took her lucrative severance package directly from Vanguard Holdings, and she left you to rot in a federal penitentiary." Brad's eyes widened in sheer paralyzing terror. The final ounce of fight completely drained from his body as the realization hit him. I had bought out his mistress. I had orchestrated his entire downfall from the inside out. He let out a strangled, defeated gasp as the federal agents shoved him forward, dragging him out of the church doors and into the flashing lights of the police cruisers waiting in the Georgia night. 2 weeks passed since the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the stained glass windows of the cathedral. 2 weeks since the absolute illusion of the perfect, flawless Jackson family was violently dismantled in front of the entire high society of Atlanta. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Vanguard Holdings did not operate on emotion, and as its chief executive officer, neither did I. The corporate machinery moved with lethal efficiency to reclaim the assets that rightfully belonged to my firm. The foreclosure notices were unceremoniously taped to the massive wrought iron gates of my parents' suburban mansion less than 48 hours after Brad was hauled away in handcuffs. The bank did not grant them a grace period. They were given a standard eviction notice, a strict deadline, and zero room for negotiation. I sat back against the plush cognac leather sofa in the center of my penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind me framed the glittering Atlanta skyline, a city I had quietly conquered, while my family was busy treating me like a disposable failure. A slow, deeply satisfying calm washed over my entire body. I swirled a glass of expensive dark red wine, taking a moment to appreciate the absolute silence of my sanctuary. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and I was relishing every single second of the aftermath. My corporate security team provided me with daily updates on the eviction process. It was a spectacular fall from grace. For decades, Patricia and Marcus had built their entire identities around looking down on others. They survived on the envy of their church congregation and their country club peers. But when the eviction day finally arrived, they were stripped of every last ounce of their manufactured dignity. Because their bank accounts were entirely frozen due to Brad's federal fraud investigation, they could not afford to hire the luxury moving companies they usually flaunted. They could not even afford a moderately priced storage unit. Instead, my parents were forced to beg for discarded, cheap brown cardboard boxes from the back alleys of local grocery stores. They had to pack their designer clothes, their expensive china, and their ridiculous status symbols into taped-up banana boxes. The spectacle of their eviction became the hottest gossip in the city. The same church deacons and wealthy socialites who had watched my mother fake her tears on the altar now slowly drove past their foreclosed mansion, rolling down their tinted windows, just to watch the mighty Jackson family carry trash bags out to the curb in the sweltering Georgia heat. Chloe suffered the hardest reality check of them all. With Brad sitting in a federal holding cell, entirely denied bail because he was deemed a massive flight risk, Chloe was left with absolutely nothing. The federal government seized her leased luxury vehicles. They froze her joint checking accounts. She was completely destitute, wearing the same wrinkled designer clothes she had worn to the church gala, because her entire wardrobe had been locked inside the house by the bank auditors. She was forced to pack whatever she could carry and stand on the sidewalk right next to our parents, completely humiliated. As I took another slow sip of my wine, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the glass coffee table in front of me. I glanced down at the screen. The caller ID flashed with my father's name. For 5 grueling years, while I was building my empire and struggling to heal from their emotional abuse, that phone never rang. They never checked to see if I was eating. They never checked to see if I was safe. Now it was ringing incessantly. I let it ring 4 times, listening to the desperate vibrating buzz before I finally reached out and pressed the accept button. I tapped the speaker icon and set the phone back down on the glass table, leaning deep into the cushions of my sofa. Maya, my mother's voice cracked through the speaker immediately. Gone was the theatrical booming voice that had commanded the church congregation. Gone was the arrogant, condescending tone she had used to mock my career choices. She sounded small, incredibly fragile, and utterly broken. The ambient noise of passing cars and loud street traffic echoed through the line. They were literally standing on the concrete curb outside the gates of their former kingdom. Maya, please do not hang up the phone. Patricia wept openly, all of her pride completely incinerated. We have absolutely nothing left. The bank auditors changed the locks this morning. They gave us exactly 30 minutes to gather our basic necessities before they forced us out the front door. We are standing on the sidewalk in the blistering heat. Your sister is sitting on a cardboard box, crying her eyes out. We have no money for a hotel. We have nowhere to go. I listened to her pathetic desperation without a single shred of sympathy. They still thought they were the victims in this scenario. They still believed they were entitled to my mercy simply because of a biological technicality. Marcus took the phone from her, his voice rough and heavy with defeat. Maya, you have made your point. You proved to everyone that you have the power. You humbled us in front of the entire city. You took our dignity. But this has gone far enough. You have to call your corporate lawyers and stop this right now. You cannot leave us out here like this. You stopped being my problem the day you stole my medical school tuition to buy your golden child a wedding dress, I replied, my voice completely cold, detached, and unwavering. You made a financial bet on a white con artist because you valued his skin color over your own common sense. You lost the bet, Marcus. Pay the house. Please, Maya. My father begged, completely abandoning his patriarchal dominance. We do not have a single dollar to our names. Brad ruined us. If you will not give us the mansion back, at least let us move into Big Mama's house. You own the deed to the historic land now. The bank transferred it to your firm. Just give us the keys to the old wooden house. We can start over there. It is small, but it will keep us off the streets. We will do anything you ask. Patricia grabbed the phone again, her voice escalating into a frantic, hysterical screech. You are our flesh and blood, Maya. You cannot do this to your own parents. You cannot leave your mother and father to die on the street like stray dogs. God will not forgive you for abandoning your family in their darkest hour. We gave you life. You owe us this much. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the sheer blinding hypocrisy of her words wash over me. She had the absolute nerve to weaponize the concept of family abandonment against the very daughter she had emotionally and financially starved for over a decade. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, bringing my face closer to the phone. I made sure my enunciation was perfectly clear, slicing through their pathetic begging with surgical precision. I did not kick you out on the street, I stated, my tone dropping to a chilling, absolute calm. You did this to yourselves. You voluntarily signed away your own home, and you actively tried to bulldoze the only pure piece of generational wealth this family ever possessed. You handed the keys of your kingdom to a predator just because you wanted to look wealthy at a country club. Maya. Please. Chloe's voice sobbed faintly in the background. Please help us. You sold the family's legacy to a scammer, I continued, speaking right over my sister's cries. I bought it back with my blood and sweat. I reclaimed what you tried to destroy. But unfortunately, there is no room for you at Big Mama's house anymore. What do you mean there is no room? My father asked. His voice was shaking, entirely stripped of the booming, authoritative tone he had used to intimidate me my entire life. We just need a roof over our heads, Maya. We can sleep on the floor in the living room. We do not need the bedrooms. Just let us inside the gates. I took a slow sip of my dark red wine, feeling the cool glass against my lips. I let him sit in his desperation for a few seconds. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating panic I felt when I was 19 years old, standing on the street with absolutely nothing because my own mother had drained my bank account. You cannot sleep on the living room floor. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy, because the living room no longer exists. Patricia gasped sharply into the phone. You tore it down! She shrieked, her voice echoing with sudden hysterical outrage. You tore down my mother's home. You hypocrite! You stood in the church and crucified Brad for wanting to bulldoze that property, and then you went and destroyed it yourself. You are a monster. I did not destroy anything. I corrected her, my tone dropping to a lethal chill. Brad wanted to pave over our heritage to build a concrete parking garage. He wanted to erase Big Mama completely to fund a mistress in Miami. I did the exact opposite. I secured the foundation. I preserved the original framework. And then I poured $5 million in cash into a massive state-of-the-art architectural expansion. The line went completely dead quiet. I could hear the faint sound of a siren wailing in the background on their end of the call, a harsh reminder of the unforgiving city streets they were currently standing on. I transformed that property, I announced, ensuring every single syllable landed like a physical blow. The small wooden house you so eagerly sold to a con artist is now the main administrative lobby of the Big Mama Scholarship and Technology Center. It is a fully funded, cutting-edge educational facility dedicated entirely to underprivileged African American children in Atlanta. I let that sink in. I wanted Patricia and Marcus to visualize the absolute magnitude of what they had lost. We have robotics labs. I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable pride. We have high-speed coding workshops. We offer full-ride college scholarships to brilliant, overlooked Black youth who just need someone to believe in them. The very kids that people like you and Brad would normally step right over on your way to the country club. I took the legacy you tried to sell for scrap, and I turned it into a permanent multi-million-dollar beacon of hope for our community. No, Patricia whispered, her voice cracking as the devastating reality washed over her. That is my mother's name. That is my family. You cannot do this without us. We belong there. We should be on the board of directors. You do not belong anywhere near that facility, I fired back, slicing through her delusional entitlement. You lost the right to use Big Mama's name the second you co-signed that fraudulent loan. The center is already operating. In fact, the mayor of Atlanta came down to cut the ribbon yesterday afternoon. It was a beautiful ceremony. The entire church congregation was there. The same deacons and city councilmen who watched you collapse on the altar last week came to shake my hand and thank Vanguard Holdings for investing in the future of our people. They are calling it the greatest philanthropic project the city has seen in a decade. My mother began to weep. It was a hollow, gut-wrenching sound. She realized that I had not just taken her money. I had taken the one thing she valued above oxygen. I had taken her social status. The entire community was currently celebrating my triumph, and her name was officially completely erased from the narrative. She would never be able to show her face at a high society gala or a church fundraiser ever again. She was officially an outcast, permanently exiled from the kingdom she had spent her entire life ruthlessly protecting. Chloe snatched the phone from our parents. Her voice was raw and raspy from days of endless crying. "Maya, please," she begged, sounding like a terrified child. "My accounts are frozen. The feds took my car. Brad's lawyers will not even return my calls. We are walking to a cheap weekly motel off the highway because it is the only place that will take us without a credit check. It is crawling with roaches. The door does not even lock properly. I cannot live like this. I am your sister." "You should have thought about that before you sat at that steakhouse and laughed at me," I said, feeling absolutely no remorse. "You should have thought about that before you mocked my career, defended a racist fraud, and cheered when your husband tried to humiliate me over a dinner bill." "I did not know what he was doing," Chloe sobbed. "I swear I did not know about the mistress or the gambling." "But you knew he was a predator," I countered sharply. "You knew he looked down on our family. You knew he treated me like trash. You just did not care because as long as he was buying you diamonds and leasing you luxury cars, you were perfectly happy to play the role of the rich, arrogant wife." "Welcome to the real world, Chloe. I suggest you start filling out job applications. I hear the overnight shift at the local diner is hiring. It builds character." "Maya, I am begging you." My father pleaded, his voice breaking in the background. "Just a few $1,000s. Just enough to get us an apartment. You have billions. You will not even miss it." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I stared out at the glittering lights of the Atlanta skyline, breathing in the sweet scent of absolute victory. "Let me explain exactly how this is going to work," I said, my voice as hard and unforgiving as steel. "Do not ever call this number again. Do not ever show up at my corporate office. And do not ever set foot near the Big Mama Technology Center. You chose your path. You chose Brad. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of your miserable lives." I did not wait for their response. I did not want to hear another second of their pathetic weeping. I pressed the red button on my screen and ended the call. I instantly blocked the number. The silence that filled my penthouse was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I set the phone face down on the glass coffee table. The war was officially over. Over the next few months, the local news cycle documented the spectacular collapse of my former family. Brad was denied bail, and ultimately pled guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud and tax evasion. Because of the overwhelming evidence provided by his former mistress, he was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. There was no country club prison for him. He was stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant smirk locked away in a concrete cell where his white privilege could no longer protect him. Chloe was forced to file for a humiliating, highly publicized divorce. With zero assets and absolutely no marketable skills, she ended up exactly where I predicted. She took a minimum wage job working the cash register at a fast food chain just to survive. The diamonds were gone. The luxury cars were gone. She spent her days wearing a greasy polyester uniform, wiping down tables, and serving the very same church members she used to look down on. My parents never recovered. Marcus and Patricia remained trapped in that rundown roadside motel. They lived off meager social security checks, entirely cut off from the glamorous world they had worshipped. Their friends abandoned them. The church congregation shunned them. They spent their remaining years sitting in a cramped, musty room with a broken television, forced to watch local news segments praising the incredible impact of the Big Mama Scholarship and Technology Center. Every single day they were reminded of the daughter they threw away, and the magnificent empire she built without them. I remained seated on my plush leather sofa, surrounded by the quiet luxury of my penthouse. The warm, low lighting of the room cast a powerful golden glow over the space. I slowly leaned back against the cushions, letting the tension fully leave my shoulders. The camera perspective seemed to slowly pull back, widening the frame to capture the absolute scale of my success. The towering glass windows, the breathtaking city skyline, the impenetrable fortress of wealth I had constructed with my own two hands. I raised my glass of vintage red wine, the deep crimson liquid catching the light. I looked directly into the lens-locking eyes with anyone who had ever been doubted, starved, or discarded by the people who were supposed to protect them. A slow, brilliant, and deeply dangerous smile spread across my face. "What is the lesson here?" I asked, my voice smooth, confident, and ringing with undeniable authority. "Never throw a bill at the child you used to starve. Because when she comes back, she will buy the entire table and kick you out of the restaurant."